Welcome to round 2. My name is Amira. I'm your chair. Judging with me is trainee Deborah. In OG, we have UK and A. And A, who's speaking first? Jamali. Right, and then OO, Taylor's DD, who's speaking first? And then Taylor's FQ, who's speaking first? Katrina. And Taylor's TV? All right, without further ado, I now invite the Prime Minister.
Madam Chair, in the status quo whereby we see that there is such big and huge gap between the city areas and the rural areas, we think that education should be a way that closes the gap between these two areas, right? And we see that how the allocation of teachers to schools as opposed to allowing teachers to apply to teach at a specific school is important, right? So before that, a couple of clarification, right? So then we see how there is an existence of problem whereby the number of teachers applying in rural areas are way lower compared to city areas, right? We see that also how between city schools or rural schools, there is sort of a gap that exists, right? How there is always city schools which are more prominent, city schools are always the better ones, right? We see there is a very large problem over there because we also always see that how in rural areas, the chances of these rural people to advance in comparison to city areas is different, right? We see how the people in the city area has more privilege compared to the rural people, right? So then we see, sit down. So then we see how, okay, so then why this gap actually occur, right? So then how employees or even fresh graduates applying for becoming a teacher, like they always have the perception, or any kind of people have the perception that the rural area is always less developed. And that's why we see that because the idea that rural area is less developed, people wouldn't want to enter further to help with the furtherance in development of the nation as a whole, right? So then why is this widening of gap very bad to begin with, right? I've already mentioned to you how in the rural area, people are already losing out. Even though, yes, we acknowledge that there are rural people who actually are able or have the chance to actually enter into university. But then we also see that even though they enter in university, there's already a gap between people from the city area and also from the rural area, right? Very simple illustration is in how in public university in Malaysia itself, that how like people in the rural area, their thinking would be different compared to the city area people, right? We also would acknowledge how certain facilities in the rural area is lesser compared to the city areas, which also already widen the gap, and is through education, right? And also the quality of education, which includes the service provider, which are the teachers, is very important, right? So then we see how that not so many facilities or development are so centralized into the city areas, and then we think that this is a losing out for the rural area, right? Yes, opening.
Consent to job of being a teacher, but not consent to the area where they have chosen what because it's
yeah.
for a student.
All right, thank you. So then why is it justifiable, right? Because we see that like becoming a teacher themselves is specifically, if we talk about rural area, it means they are more often paid by the government, right? So it means that the government's money is based on taxpayers' money. And then why is it so? So then we see that the use of tax is actually for everyone, which doesn't exclusively for city area people, but it also balances out city and also rural people, right? How taxes or any kind of welfare that the state has, it should be equally distributed to all the citizens, right? Sit down. So then we also see in the case whereby when the state see that there is a gap that occurs in the society, like when it includes like huge social or economical gap, like the state has the responsibility to provide services that would be able to close the gap, right? And this includes education, right? So then we also see how like even teachers as employee, right? Yet, so then this is the problem, or this is the issue, right? So then teachers or like even any kind of people, like when they look into the job opportunities that they have, they'll always prefer jobs which are closer to home. This means that what defines home will be things that they are accessible to, right? Accessible towards facilities and accessible towards services, right? And in this also includes like maybe shopping or whatever not, like, so then this kind of situation or this kind of situation is already can be seen that there are more kind of facilities, there are more kinds of development that are already centralized and focused in the city areas, and eventually teachers have the tendency to prefer city areas people, right? City areas places, right? So then also the other thing is on how the idea of when the idea is that when they have jobs, it means they have pay, right? The idea of pay is that how they have the purchasing power and they have the spending power, right? So then things are more materialistic. How even as fresh graduates, when they come out from universities, they would want to spend their money. So then where they would spend is definitely in the city area. They'll focus more in the city areas because that's where all their services, all their spending power and material stuff comes from, right? So then we also see, so then why specifically education that will be able to solve this kind of issue, right? So, yes.
Would you force teachers in your world to teach subjects they don't specialize in and have no interest to teach whatsoever?
Thank you. So then, you see, like in the motion itself, we're talking about like specific school. So then it means that they would also have their own specialization in terms of subjects, but at the same time, just that they go into specific schools, so it means that how they enter into schools are different, but then they still teach what they are majoring in, right? So then, yeah. So then in terms of education, right? Okay, so then we see how as students of rural area, right, they are able to be advanced more when we have quality teachers that are evenly distributed in these two areas, right? So then we see how taxes are the one that pay the teacher, right? So then I've mentioned before how taxes should be equally distributed out. So then we see that how when teachers are able to give these quality services towards these students, these students from the rural area who already have the knowledge and skills already, right? And we see how later on these we give them more chance to give back to the community, right? In fact, in comparison, how if these rural students are receiving poor quality kind of education, we see the ability for them to advance more in the society, and the ability for them to contribute back to the community is way lesser, and we regret about that, right? Thank you.
All right, I think Prime Minister, I invite you. Here you go. Thank you. You're here.
On opening opposition, we believe that teachers should have the freedom to choose where they want to teach to ensure the best quality of teaching in the schools that they choose to work in. Before I argue why this policy harms the teaching quality in schools, I want to first respond to Prime Minister. So 2 minutes of the Prime Minister's speech is dedicated to telling us that there's currently a problem within rural schools and city schools. I agree that there is a problem. But the question in this debate asks us to see where we can best effectively put teachers in order for them to effectively teach or give the best type of education to schools. Within my argument, I'll tell you why this is intrinsically related to the motivations teachers have, and the moment they feel that they have been robbed of the ability to choose where they want to be in essentially the quality of education decreases. But then if we look at their model, so essentially I have to ask, would you then put less talented teachers in very good schools? Because in the converse, if the converse is true that they would put all these very good teachers in rural schools to help these rural schools, then how would they be able to sustain these very good schools? We think it's important that very good schools still have a supply of very good teachers, because there are very specific demands that need to be met. For example, if you're a smart school or an athletic school, the type of teachers that are likely to go into these schools are teachers that have possibly got postgraduate education, or teachers that have got very specific niche training. The moment they are removed from these schools, or they're less likely to be placed in these schools, we think the quality of education here begins to drop, because they're unable to meet the demands of the quality of education, or B, even if they were put to additional training, we think that means there's a loss of time for the schools to be able to gain the investment of their teachers to be in these schools. The second point they highlight is that a lot of teachers base their decisions on comfort, or like them being close to home. We think this is very important, because on their side, if they do not base this on comfort and they are immediately put in a very uncomfortable place, so for example, if a rural school teacher who generally wants to teach in a rural school is now forced into the city, or the converse where a city school teacher is now forced into a rural area, we think their ability to adapt becomes more difficult, because A, they don't feel they have access to the things that they want that makes their life comfortable, so we think this detracts them from being able to go to schools with a peace of mind, or being able to teach effectively, because they're constantly worrying about the fact that I don't really like where I stay, or I don't really like the environment that I live in, and I'm unable to find the motivation to go to school with the type of energy that I want in when I go to the school. So we think the fact that teachers decide based on their comforts of home is very important, and they need to tell us why they can trade off this metric, especially when teachers intrinsically tie their motivation of where they teach to where they live. Finally, they assert that students can now advance. So I don't know how this looks like. Does it now mean that immediately you place good teachers there and the teacher-student relationship becomes very good, and immediately students can move into cities? We don't think that's necessarily going to be true, and I'll tell you why this isn't going to be true within my argumentation. I'll take one from closing.
Right. So under your rule, schools in vulnerable areas can never have access to that qualified sports teacher that you wanted to talk about. How is it in your world would you give access to these qualified teachers then to these specific areas?
So we think the type of teachers we support on our side doesn't necessarily have to be the most qualified teachers on their side. Rather, they need to be adequate in the way that they train or come participate in the schools. The reason why we think even this is important is because for those teachers that may not be as qualified as a city school teacher, the fact that they are placed in a rural school means that if they face a particular challenge, or the fact that they may not have a sports track, or the fact that they may not have as many students participating in the athletics program, these are the very teachers that will have the leadership capabilities to drive or create programs that want to be able to help themselves, as compared to just a very qualified school teacher that comes in there but doesn't feel any sort of attachment to the school, or be able to relate or feel like I can actually contribute meaningfully to these schools. Into argumentation, I think there's two parts to this. First, we need to analyze what their system looks like now in very good, well-equipped schools. We think, what are the incentives of teachers to apply to these schools? Firstly, we think it's the fact that they may have greater access to career progression, or the fact that these schools have very good facilities and very good students to begin with. We think it's valid for teachers to choose to work in these schools, because it means, firstly, that they are able to adapt to the environment that the schools come into. The fact that they are able to say that this is the area I want to teach in because it's the most meaningful way I can contribute to the teaching process within this classroom. We think it's important to note that the comparative on their side is when they feel forced into these class environments, they don't feel a genuine attachment to these schools. That means if they face a particular problem with their students, the fact that maybe some students could be a bit bratty, or maybe some students may not be as open to their class lessons, means that these teachers are more likely to blame themselves for feeling, I don't actually feel I have the motivation, I don't actually feel I'm very good enough because I feel I was forced into this situation to begin with and my potential wasn't properly channeled into a meaningful way. Secondly, no thank you, we think in less equipped schools, right, we think this could possibly be the interior schools or schools with very high discipline problems. The reason why on opening opposition, we are more than willing to trade off the highest number of highest number of teachers going to these schools, but more importantly focus on the motivation of the teachers that go in these schools, is because of the commitment they place in these schools. Because if they are forced, we think the comparative that the government has to defend is teachers that feel less committed to creating lesson plans or likely to just stick to the syllabus and do the most minimal amount of work because they feel they don't really want to be there to begin with. We think these are teachers that are likely to try and find different ways to leave these school environments or just to try and go through day by day just doing the least that they want to do. We think this is more harmful to the students because for students that face many struggles at home or for students that actually face reading and writing problems, they are unlikely to be addressed because the teachers are likely to find the most convenient ways to deal or engage within these classrooms because they don't feel that this is where they can meaningfully engage in the teaching process they want to begin with. We think the harm of this is twofold. One, I think most students are likely to be left out because they don't feel they can genuinely form an attachment with their teachers. So we think if you don't already feel a genuine attachment because you live in a rural area and there are many countering forces that say you shouldn't go to school, you should help us at home or you should work with your family, I think this is one more reason for the child not to go to school because the child feels less connected or less attached to these teachers. What is the comparative on our side? We think on our side, we get very motivated teachers, even though in a significantly lower number. But this is particularly important. Why? Because when they genuinely believe they can work hard to uplift the lives of these individuals, two benefits you get on our side. We think the leadership quality that you get here is that if there's a particularly big structural problem or they need things like funding, these are the teachers that are first who are going to take on the responsibility to work around these systems. Even if your principal wants to believe you, they're more likely to believe you because they've seen your genuine compassion or commitment to these students. We think secondly, the fact that they can now carry on their experiences and go on to talk to teachers within their connected circle to say, this is an important school I thought that I can meaningfully engage, is a benefit we get on our side. Because in the world of opposition, the teachers feel forced, the teachers don't feel like they belong in these schools, are likely to leave the school areas and say, you shouldn't go to that rural area to teach in that school because that is a particularly devastating place to be teaching in. You will not be able to find meaningful job. You should just likely opt out of the teaching profession. We think the harm on their side is they're more likely to opt out of the teaching profession because they don't feel like anywhere they go, they don't have a choice or control over the type of environment that they are teaching in. We think the biggest harm in the world of government, and they need to defend this, is teachers feeling less motivated when they enter the classroom, and as a result of that, negate the type of quality at teaching that they can offer into classrooms.
I think LY 9 right here.
I think from the get-go, from LO's speech itself, we see that there's a slight problem from what they're trying to propose, right? Where they told you that comfort is the only thing that will make teachers more motivated to teach in schools at the end of the day. And we will tell you why the role of teachers itself is very much important here. And the comfort, like, it matters, but it's only in a slighter scale, right? So before I'll start my speech by rebutting the LO, right? So he came up here and talked to you about how these teachers, when they have that comfort, when they can choose the schools that they want to teach in, they would have that comfort and they would have that motivation to make better lesson plans and to make better like plans for like these kids to learn at the end of the day, right? So we see that like at the end of the day, we see that what are the role of teachers, right? A teacher is supposed to educate and to give education no matter the circumstances of wherever they're teaching in, right? So let's say, for example, if they're teaching in a rural community, in a school located in a rural area, right, where more often than not, there are lack of resources and like lack of infrastructure and whatnot, right? We see that, no thank you, that we see that even if that is the case, that these teachers with the mind that with the knowledge that they have, with the skills that they have as teachers, they would then still be motivated to teach at the end of the day, right? Because their end goal is to educate people, not to just gain like own personal benefits and whatnot, right? We see that even if they do that for their own personal benefit, we see that like comfort doesn't play like a major role in this, right? Second thing, where they also talked about how like teachers will be then motivated to teach at the school that they want to teach in, right? And how they implied that we said that like less qualified teachers or the most qualified teachers will be sent to these like rural areas, and the less qualified teachers will be sent to like schools in the cities and whatnot, right? No, thank you. But Jemima has already explained to you that these teachers will be equally distributed throughout the schools, right? Like the cities don't just get like the most qualified teachers and the least qualified teachers go to rural areas, right? So there'll be a mix of like a pool of teachers going to each school, right? So like every school would then have like different ideas, like different ways of thinking of teachers, right? So how is this like intrinsically important? And so we see that there'll be more discourse, there'll be more ideas on how that pool of ideas contributed by each educator can then help to improve that community of students at the end of the day. Right? No, thank you. And like they also talked about how would then, if we like teach this kind of rural community at the end of the day, like how would then they provide back to society or whatnot, right? So we tell you that if we like allocate these teachers to these rural areas, and like at the end of the day, we can see that as a result that these children from these areas can give back to the society, right? How? We tell you that when they are being taught by these teachers, which essentially under our paradigm, we see that these teachers are motivated to teach on their own, not just because they don't have comfort that they don't teach, right? So we see that because of the way that they teach these students or whatnot, we see that these students can then be motivated to become teachers also at the end of the day, which is like can happen under our paradigm, and they can also choose to become teachers and contribute back to their community at the end of the day. So before I move on, yes.
So you suggested that you want to have a mix of teachers in these schools. So for a less qualified teacher, now what will the interaction look like with a very qualified teacher when they're less likely to be included within that circle of teachers because they don't deserve to be in that place to begin with?
Okay, so like it doesn't mean that they're less included. Like at least whatever that they're trying to propose to that community won't be their ideas alone, right? Like all the teachers like can then discuss what is the best for that community of community of students in that particular area, right? Like a very qualified teacher cannot just suddenly go there and say that I want to use like applications on an iPhone to teach them how to like make trajectories and whatnot, right? They cannot do that. So they need to discuss with other teachers, even if they have like different qualities and whatnot, to discuss what is the best for these students. So I will move on to my substantive, which is how, under our paradigm, if we allocate these teachers to these communities, will lead to the progression of the society, right? So I will analyze this in two levels, right? How this will then lead to the progression of the students of these rural communities, and also how would then this lead the progression of these teachers at the end of the day, right? So what kind of progression of students are we talking about, right? So we see that at the end of the day, when we allocate teachers to these areas, like these students can have better accessibility to education, right? So because we see that like in city area, like in cities and whatnot, we see that only more little to no students from rural areas studying here, right? So we see that when we allocate teachers to these areas, they can have more accessibility to education, right? So like what LO question just now. So when you assign teachers to these rural areas, they'll have one, lack of resources, like for example, no infrastructure or like no teaching aids or whatnot, and won't be conventional or won't be comfortable for them to teach in these sort of areas, right? But we also told you that as a teacher itself, like you have the necessary skills, and you have your end goal is to teach people and to like make them a better person, right? And not just to gain for your personal benefits. And also we see that the status quo of teachers nowadays, right? Like one, they like more often than not, they graduate with like very high interpersonal skills or whatnot, right? And we see that like at the end of the day that they also will have that motivation to teach these students no matter what circumstances that they are in, right? And we see that under our paradigm, what's our worst case scenario, right? That teachers don't like the place that they teach in, right? And like we see that, but we see that more later on that higher chances of self-actualization of these teachers can then happen, which leads to the progression of these teachers itself, right? Because we see how it's characterized just now. Like teachers, they are smart, they know what's going on with the world, but you don't know stuff like entirely until you experience it yourself at the end of the day, right? So when you allocate these teachers to these kind of areas, like rural areas, in order for them to teach and like to teach in that areas, so they would have a better understanding of what is going on in these areas, what these students face through in their daily life, right? So like they would break out of that bubble of that they need to work somewhere that they're comfortable with somewhere near their home. Instead, they would think of like, working here, like I can help more people, so it then help them more, right? So we see that under our paradigm, we help the rural community more. Thank you.
I think the MIDP idea.
It is unfortunate that we take teachers for granted, that we literally, inside government, uproot them from their families, their lifestyles, their comfort, everything that they have to call home, at the expense of that to say we have better access to education. You must understand that this debate, mere numbers does not equate to the access that government would like to provide you, but it is the quality of the access that is important that Davis emphasized in a speech that went unengaged. I will talk to you about a few things in my speech I'll talk to you about a few things in my speech. So Dave talked to you about the motivational aspects of how quality of education can be perceived. I'm going to extend this further by talking to you about how the most talented pool of teachers can stay in the circuit of teachers, and secondly, the reputation of rural schools and how those things improve. Before that, I'm going to take out the speaker before me in an issue. So I think a new argumentation that sort of came up was about how mixed teachers was a great benefit if they do integrate within the system. There are three reasons why this is a terrible idea. Firstly, that teachers interacting from different backgrounds means that you have less qualified teachers interacting with more qualified teachers. This leads to a few outcomes. Firstly, that they won't include them in their groups or exclusive cliques, right? Because like, if you don't find commonality with the teacher or you don't find commonality with your colleagues, then you're less likely to click with them. But also, given that they have mentioned to you that there's a stereotype on these teachers, that some of them are perhaps more privileged from a city area and some teachers are less qualified perhaps from a rural area, that means you have a very thick line divide within teachers that they are likely to segregate each other or stereotype each other in that sense. But for a second reason, as far as it comes to benefits like idea generation or the usage of technology in the classrooms or trying to use that in their workplace, right? This means that their trainings are different. That the trainings that a privileged teacher from perhaps a city area had was one that they're used to technology and used to teaching and learning and training of technology, right? The moment you try to put that teacher in a place where there's less of those facilities, I think that this teacher not only will struggle, as Dave suggests, but more likely will also be criticized for their methods because it's not used as a norm in those places, but also very hard to access those types of learning through the usage of those technologies as well. No thanks. Next, I think the conclusion or outcome of this issue is simple, that they'll be outcasted for various reasons, not one reason, but various reasons are ones that will make them feel excluded, but also perhaps less motivated to teach, also less included in the ways that they can be included to restructure societies, as I will suggest. Before I move on to my argumentation, sure. Closing.
If comfortable teachers go to high-performing schools. You don't need to work as hard because they're already high-performing. You can rely more on technology because they're already high-performing, or it seems more fancy. Does this really maximize the quality of good teachers?
No, so what you have on that side is a teacher who's from a rural area that you have to defend, that this teacher from a rural area who's less trained perhaps because of circumstances will have a hard time adapting in those spaces, but also be outcasted because they can't adapt as fast as other teachers as well. So I don't think they necessarily solve that on that side. If it's true that the adaptation is a problem there, then they don't solve that. My argumentation about restructuring, there'll be two folds about this. Firstly, on how you're likely to influence teachers to believe that rural areas are bad. So what happens here is that you feel that you're obligated by the government perhaps to be a mere tool of the state to be allocated wherever it is. So you feel it's like a rite of passage that you have to go through this bad school or rural area school in this case in order to progress your teaching career. This means that you literally deter people from being teachers for a few reasons. That people shift their teaching passions to something else, and you lose the most talented pool of individuals who could be teachers because they're passionate, but rather feel that it's risky because I don't have control over my life, I don't have control over my career, there's so much uncertainty to what I have to go through as a teacher or as an individual. And in that sense, I think you lose a lot of numbers who were initially willing to join the workforce because they feel that, oh, I have a passion for teaching and it's good and convenient for me that I can go to wherever I want to, maybe be charitable and help like rural area schools at some point in my training program as well. And I think that you lose teachers who initially had this passion because you shut them out from the option of choosing. So the second argument, the second harm that we do have that does restructure is this, that you reduce the reputations of rural area schools. This means that if teachers go unwillingly to rural area schools, they'll continue the norms and perpetuate the stereotypes that were initially there. So if government suggests that rural area schools, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but at the point that you put teachers that truly believe that they are put there because it's a terrible place and I have to do something about it now, that means you continually perpetuate this idea. I think what teachers are likely to do at this point is that they're likely to confirm the biases, and whenever they interact, this is where it gets harmful, whenever they interact with other individuals, right, that's when they will tell their other colleagues that to say that, oh, I've been to this rural school, it's a terrible place, I wasn't prepared to go there, but I had to go there, and I don't think you should go there if you ever could as well. Yeah, just try not to be a teacher if you could. I think that this also perpetuates a terrible norm or stereotype on these rural schools, but also creates a harmful definition of what it is to be a teacher in modern society and modern day as well. To wing our arguments at this point. The first thing we did prove to from opening opposition is this, that we have motivated teachers. What does this mean? At least teachers go willingly to opt into these jobs, that they get to control their pay, their circumstances of where they'd like to work as far as they can. The point that we get is this, that teachers don't drop out because of their pay or because they are removed from their families, or there's less barriers to just being a teacher as well. Understand that it's already very hard to be a teacher because of all the emotional stress they are put on already. The least we could do is make it easier for them. Opening opposition champions these things. Secondly, the most talented pool of teachers stays. So what this will look like in opening opposition is this, that because they have control over their careers and that there is certainty in the jobs and the aspects they like to work, they are more likely to stay in the teaching career no matter where it is. So if they lose a job, they're more likely to opt to a job that also is comfortable or preferable for them as well. Thirdly, rural schools. What will happen here? I think they get better reputation. Firstly, because I mentioned to you that they won't get a bad name or like a harmful name to continue these stereotypes. But secondly, if you have good teachers who will willingly go into these schools, that means you spread a better name for these schools, that these teachers are likely to tell their colleagues in converse that, oh, I had such a great time in these places. Sure, it's not the best places, but I'm sure we can work on that, and I'd love to have you on my team to work on that as well, whenever they have these expeditions and whatnot. I think that this is a benefit that's unique to opening opposition and only can be done if you do not force these teachers into a condition that they do not appreciate.
The passion of a teacher who must undergo overburdens that are placed as a result of the shortages within that school, when they are placed in classrooms with large amounts of students, and they therefore cannot control or therefore cannot form a particular relationship with each student, that's when that passion dies down. In the world of side opposition, when you force them into positions in which they simply cannot have any control over or are simply incapable of being a teacher in that specific classroom, that's when your passion dies down, and any form of motivation is less likely to happen under side opposition. There's one new argument that I will bring to you today as to why the shortage of teachers in areas there's a shortage of teachers in areas in most of need of educational development. We think OG told you that there is a shortage and there's incentives for that shortage to exist, but we extend by explaining how this shortage harms both parties, not only the teachers but as well as the students. And secondly, how our policy particularly fixes this problem. We think second thing that we'll bring to you on this table is how this policy specifically benefits teachers, not just in terms of their ability to grow as a teacher, but secondly as the passion that they could possibly be in the vocation that they decided to have most meaning to them. We think a clear clarification that we need to have is that this debate severely narrowed down to only allocation by numbers. We think while it's true that numbers is probably the priority in which we would allocate teachers, we think there are a couple of other things that we also extend by saying is quite important. We would also look at things like proximity. So if it's really unreasonable for you to move to like one end of the state to another end of the state, then we possibly won't do that unless there is a genuine need for you to do so, and there's really little teachers in that proximate area. We don't think that would actually happen, but we think that's something that we would take into consideration. But we also look into the specialization of that specific school, whether it's a vocational, whether or not it's a vocational school, whether or not it's a special needs school for specific students, or whether or not it's a primary or secondary school. We would also look at the specificity of that school and whether or not that teacher has the qualifications for it. We don't think it's simply about numbers, and we would extend to that. We think the first thing I think there's one issue of rebuttal that I would find before moving on to my extension. This idea about teachers will find it really difficult to adapt, and they won't find that passion. The first thing is that this is really unrealistic, because this characterization is based on the fact that rural teachers would move to city schools. I have no idea why this is true, right? Because if it's true that this is based on numbers and where it's most needed, then your rural areas need more teachers, right? And so it's less likely for a state to allocate a teacher from a rural area to a city school if there is the most need of it within that rural area itself. So we don't think that this scenario is particularly realistic. But even if this is possible, we think the period of adapting and period of becoming comfortable within that private school is a lot less harmful than being in a school that would constantly have a shortage, that when being a school that literally always imposes work on you as a result of having no other teachers to impose that work for you. We think there's a whole bunch of reasons why adapting is something that is very much possible and can be a lot rewarding, right? Firstly, we think teachers can support one another when all teachers realize that they are put in here, when they're put in here in the same position and now must go through the same experiences. But secondly, we think we can, if it's necessary, we can provide training for them or some form of teaching, training to allow them to adapt to these specific schools. We think that's something that's completely possible. But thirdly, we think they also have financial reasons to learn to adapt really quickly, because teachers maybe also be passionate, but they also need money, and they also need a salary, they also need bonuses, and all these things literally mean they have that financial incentive to make sure that they adapt quickly. And I think the harm of adaptation is a lot less escapable than the harm of being always stuck in a school that imposes a lot of burdens upon you as a result of that shortage. Take a seat. Why do we come into this debate, right? We think the shortage of teachers comes in two fronts, and this is not explained by our opening. But not only are there absent teachers, but there are underqualified teachers. And the most prevalent shortages occur in the most vulnerable schools, not just rural areas like our OG wanted to talk to you about, but special needs schools that require specific qualifications, or vernacular schools that have historically faced a shortage of teachers in that sense. We think the impact of this is that you create a very high teacher-student ratio, in which many public schools have have teachers teaching 50 student classrooms, and that's particularly harmful to teachers. We think firstly they're overburdened with work because there is no other teacher to allocate this kind of work burden to them. The ability to focus on your lesson plans, the ability for you to create meaningful syllabus is a lot less reduced when you have your attention spread to many students, right? But it's also just very physically demanding, because it's harder for you to control a 50 student classroom than a 20 student classroom. classroom, and it comes as a direct result of people not wanting to go into schools of rural areas, right? So we think as a result, the ability for teachers to maximize their potential is reduced. But your students are like also harmed in this end of the stick. We think they cannot receive personalized education because the attention of a teacher is massively spread out to each individual student. So particularly in like rural areas, right, where you would like some students face significantly different experiences from other students, we think that's when it's very important for teachers to be able to personalize or change their course material in order to fit the needs of this particular child. That is less likely to happen under your side when you have to do this for 50 other students as well. We think that's a harm that comes under there. But also the relationship and attachment you form with your teachers are less likely to happen, because when there's a shortage of them, that means you're more likely to have substitute teachers or 3-month replacement teachers. That's when they're less likely to believe that I can form a long-term relationship with my students. I can form a relationship that builds over years, and as a result, before that, Dev.
Why is your teachers willing to form this attachment for both the extra month to understand the struggles when they already told themselves, I do not want to be here and I'm unwilling to adapt to the circumstances of students around me?
Okay, see how this is a contradiction, because they were also the same team that said that teachers are built on passion and they also want to help their students, and in that same breath say, oh, but I also don't want to be in this school because I don't teach my students. But they also ignore the plethora of other incentives for them to build that relationship, because they can be a better teacher, they can find more fulfillment, they need a salary and they need to perform well. These are all things that means that they're more likely to form that relationship then. The comparative is this: if a government knows that shortage is a problem in a specific place, that's when you can put teachers within those schools, teachers that can specifically that's when you can spread teachers out a lot more. Note that both sides have limited pool of teachers. This debate is about which side has a more effective spread. This is the trade-off we will make, and this is the only one we will make. We think maybe some schools face a decrease in teachers, but we think these schools are better capable of handling that shortages of teachers as compared to that rural area that would constantly have a shortage in that sense. But we think more importantly, how you specifically benefit teachers in terms of their career development. We think a lot of teachers enter schools as a result of their passion and the desire to teach, but this blindsides the fact that they may not be as capable to teach these students as possible. As a result, you have many bright young fresh graduates entering tough schools with high cases of bullying because they generally believe that they can save these groups of people. But that's when you face the overburden of work. That's when you cannot handle the complaints of certain students as a result of your bullying. That's when your passion dies, because you do not fulfill the impact of helping your child because you're so overburdened with work. That's when you stay stagnant in your career because you simply cannot do as well because of all the work that you have in handling many children. As a result, not only are teachers more incapable under your side, but the passion of each and every teacher dies in the world of side opposition.